Karoline Leavitt stood calmly in the courtroom, her presence composed but unyielding. She had come prepared for a legal battle, but what unfolded went beyond anything she, or anyone in the room, expected. The judge, known for his arrogant demeanor and questionable ethics, peered down at her from the bench with thinly veiled contempt. His words, sharp and deliberate, cut through the courtroom's tension. "This isn't some campaign rally, Ms. Leavitt," he sneered. "Your dramatics won't work here. Perhaps you should stick to the press conferences. You seem more comfortable with microphones than the law." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The insult wasn't just personal. It was condescending, calculated, and entirely inappropriate from someone tasked with upholding justice impartially. Leavitt, however, didn't flinch. She returned the judge's icy glare with quiet defiance. But even she couldn't predict what would happen next. Barely 10 minutes later, the courtroom door swung open. 2 U.S. Marshals strode in with solemn determination, their pace brisk, their expressions unreadable. The judge, now visibly uneasy, attempted to carry on as if nothing was amiss. But when the lead marshal approached the bench and produced a federal arrest warrant, the room froze. "Judge Barrett Chambers," the marshal said, his voice firm, "you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, bribery, and abuse of judicial authority." Silence crashed over the courtroom. The judge paled, his arrogant posture collapsing into a stunned slump. He looked around wildly, as if searching for some invisible ally to shield him from the consequences he had long evaded. There was none. Leavitt stood in still silence, watching the judge who had just tried to belittle her be escorted from the bench in handcuffs. The symbolism was powerful. The gavel that once struck with prejudice now echoed with accountability. The charges against Judge Chambers had been building quietly for months. An internal investigation, triggered by multiple complaints and leaks from whistleblowers, had uncovered damning evidence. He had allegedly taken bribes in exchange for favorable rulings and actively suppressed key evidence in multiple cases. The courtroom outburst toward Leavitt may have been the final misstep in a long pattern of misconduct. Court staff and onlookers sat in stunned disbelief as Chambers was led away. Some murmured in shock, others in vindication. For too long, whispers of corruption had hovered around him, yet no one had dared challenge his authority. Until now. Karoline Leavitt's team later confirmed that while she had not been directly involved in the investigation, her legal team had submitted a formal ethics complaint weeks earlier, citing irregularities in pretrial proceedings. The wheels of justice, slow as they may turn, had finally aligned. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed for statements. Leavitt declined to gloat. "This isn't about me," she said firmly. "This is about integrity in our legal system. No one, no matter how powerful, is above the law." Her composure in the face of public insult, followed by the poetic justice that played out before the court, sent shockwaves through the political and judicial circles. What was meant to be a routine hearing had become a moment of reckoning, and while the headlines would undoubtedly focus on the dramatic twist, judge arrested minutes after berating Karoline Leavitt, the real story was about accountability, courage, and the downfall of a man who thought his robe made him untouchable. In the span of 1 hour, the courtroom saw the abuse of power, the endurance of grace, and the fall of a corrupt figure whose own arrogance led him straight into handcuffs. As Judge Chambers was escorted through the courthouse halls in handcuffs, the stunned silence turned into a growing hum of disbelief and then satisfaction. Court employees, attorneys, and even rival politicians who had long harbored suspicions about the judge exchanged looks of grim affirmation. What had once been dismissed as speculation was now undeniable reality. The shield of his office, once a symbol of immunity, had shattered. Karoline Leavitt remained composed as she exited the courtroom. Cameras surged toward her, microphones extended like spears. The media was ravenous for her reaction. She paused briefly at the top of the courthouse steps, her expression calm but resolute. "What we saw today was not just a moment of drama," she said, voice steady over the chaos of reporters. "It was a reminder that justice doesn't bend forever. It eventually snaps back. The law isn't a weapon for the powerful to wield. It's a shield for the people. And today the people saw it work. Leavitt made no mention of the judge's insult. She didn't need to. The public had seen it, heard it, felt it. And they had also witnessed the instant karma that followed. Her silence on the matter only amplified the moment's weight. Behind the scenes, federal investigators were preparing a wider sweep. Chambers wasn't the only name mentioned in the sealed indictments. The arrest had been timed with precision. Federal sources later confirmed that the hearing was monitored in real time, and the warrant had been ready pending final confirmation from DOJ officials. The operation, known internally as Clean Bench, had reportedly begun after a confidential informant provided evidence that Chambers had accepted more than $500,000 in bribes over a span of 5 years. These bribes allegedly came from a network of attorneys and developers seeking favorable rulings. It was a web of influence that stretched from backroom deals to courtroom outcomes. Leavitt's confrontation with him, though unplanned, had inadvertently triggered a wave of national attention. Her visibility forced the case into the public eye at a moment when investigators needed pressure to act decisively. As one DOJ official later put it, the judge didn't just get caught, he got caught in the spotlight. That spotlight didn't fade. Within 24 hours, multiple news outlets ran deep investigations into Chambers' rulings, noting patterns of favoritism, sudden case dismissals, and procedural delays that curiously aligned with outside interests. Retired attorneys began speaking out. Former plaintiffs, once silenced or ignored, found their voices again. As for Leavitt, her composure in the courtroom and her refusal to turn the moment into a political stunt earned rare bipartisan respect. Even critics admitted she had shown uncommon discipline under direct verbal assault. She could have lost her temper. She didn't, one legal analyst noted. She could have stormed out. She stood her ground. And in the end, the system validated her patience. By week's end, Judge Chambers had resigned in disgrace. His mugshot, widely circulated, became a symbol of accountability long delayed. But for those watching, it wasn't just about one corrupt man. It was about the resilience of the law when people have the courage to stand firm in the face of intimidation. Karoline Leavitt had come into that courtroom expecting a fight. She didn't throw a punch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Justice did it for her. In the days that followed, the ripple effects of Judge Chambers' arrest spread rapidly through the judicial and political systems. Court cases he had presided over were reopened. Defense attorneys filed motions for retrials, citing bias and impropriety. Prosecutors scrambled to re-examine decisions that now appeared tainted by corruption. The integrity of an entire docket was under question, and trust in the local legal system had been shaken to its core. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt returned to Washington, where the spotlight continued to follow her. Though she had refused to center herself in the story, it was impossible to ignore the symbolism of what had occurred. A young, rising political force had faced down institutional power, and won not by force or fury, but by standing firm in truth. In interviews, she remained measured, careful not to gloat or politicize the situation. "I didn't come to that courtroom looking for a fight," she told one national outlet. "I came looking for justice, and what happened after? Well, that wasn't my doing. That was the system finally catching up to someone who thought he was untouchable." That statement resonated far beyond the courtroom walls. Supporters saw it as a defining moment of moral clarity, proof that Leavitt wasn't just another political figurehead, but someone with the grit to confront real-world corruption head-on. Even many independents and moderates, previously skeptical of her combative style, praised her restraint and integrity under pressure. But behind the scenes, Leavitt's inner circle understood the deeper implications. The judge's arrest had exposed more than personal corruption. It revealed a systemic rot, one that would require legislative oversight and reform. She quickly began drafting proposals aimed at increasing judicial transparency, mandating external audits of judicial finances, and protecting whistleblowers within the court system. "This is bigger than one judge," she told her staff in a closed-door meeting. We can't let this die in the news cycle. If we stop at his downfall, we've missed the point. The system has to be stronger than the people who abuse it. Unsurprisingly, the opposition attempted to downplay the scandal, accusing Leavitt of politicizing the justice system. But that narrative failed to gain traction. The facts were too damning, the visuals too powerful, the outcome too raw. Chambers had publicly insulted her, and within minutes, had been removed in disgrace. No spin could undo that. As she stood before the House Judiciary Committee weeks later, presenting her plan for judicial accountability reform, her opening words were not boastful, but direct. I am not here because of a personal insult. I am here because that insult was a symptom of a much deeper disease. A culture of arrogance and unaccountability in corners of our justice system. And that ends now. The hearing room was packed, cameras rolled, and across the country, people who had watched the viral clip of that fateful courtroom exchange now saw the follow-through, the quiet power of someone refusing to be bullied, and instead channeling that moment into lasting reform. Karoline Leavitt didn't win through confrontation. She won through composure, through resilience, through the undeniable weight of the truth, and in a system often criticized for protecting its own. She proved that with enough courage, even the most powerful can be held to account, one gavel strike at a time. In the months that followed, Karoline Leavitt's influence grew beyond headlines and sound bites. What began as a courtroom standoff evolved into a national conversation about integrity in the judiciary. Her proposed Judicial Accountability and Transparency Act gained bipartisan momentum, a rare feat in an increasingly polarized Congress. The act called for a comprehensive overhaul of judicial oversight. It included mandatory financial disclosures audited by independent bodies, strict penalties for ethical violations, and the establishment of a federal hotline for court employees to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. It also proposed term reviews for federal judges, a once taboo subject now finding support in light of Chambers' scandal. Leavitt's resolve in advancing the bill echoed the same poise she had displayed that day in court. She met with lawmakers across the aisle, listened to legal experts, and refined the bill until it was airtight. What surprised many wasn't just her policy savvy, it was her refusal to let the moment slip into political theater. She kept the focus squarely on systemic reform. Meanwhile, more stories emerged. A second judge in the same district resigned quietly after learning he too was under investigation. Several attorneys known to be close to Chambers were disbarred or placed under review. An entire network of judicial favoritism, once shielded by silence, began to unravel. For years, people had whispered about corruption. Now they had proof. And they had a champion. Media outlets, left and right alike, couldn't ignore the momentum. Op-eds appeared daily, some praising Leavitt's boldness, others cautioning about the scope of her proposals. Yet the public, tired of corruption scandals, without consequences, rallied behind her. Polls showed surging support not just for her personally, but for the reform she represented. Her courtroom composure had become a defining image, a young woman standing silent under fire, allowing the truth to speak louder than outrage. That image appeared on magazine covers and campaign ads, even in classrooms where civics teachers used it as a case study in modern democratic accountability. But Leavitt remained cautious about the attention. In an address at a university law symposium, she reminded students of the core lesson. It wasn't about me winning and him losing. It was about the system doing its job, even if it took longer than it should have. And that's what we owe every American, faith that the law serves them, not just the powerful. Her words weren't just rhetoric. Behind closed doors, she worked late into the night, reviewing legislation, fielding calls from court whistleblowers, and navigating the complex resistance from entrenched legal institutions. She knew the fight for reform wouldn't be easy or clean, but she also knew she had already faced worse. She had been insulted, underestimated, and dismissed in open court. And in response, she stood still, unmoved, undeterred, and watched the system turn on the man who thought he was above it. That moment didn't make her a hero. It made her a threat to every corner of corruption that hoped to stay hidden, and she wasn't going anywhere. As the Judicial Accountability and Transparency Act moved through committee hearings, resistance mounted from powerful legal associations and longtime judges who viewed the proposed changes as an intrusion on judicial independence. Yet Karoline Leavitt remained undeterred. Every press conference, every floor debate, every interview, she repeated the same message. This is not about control, it's about accountability. Behind the scenes, lobbyists scrambled to dilute the bill's strongest provisions. Amendments were quietly proposed to remove the independent audit clause or weaken whistleblower protections, but Leavitt was ready. She anticipated every tactic and countered with facts, testimony from victims of judicial misconduct, and the undeniable public pressure mounting behind her. When the bill finally reached the House floor, it was no longer just her cause. It was a movement. Citizens from across the country sent letters, made phone calls, and posted thousands of messages online, all echoing the same sentiment. We deserve better. Petitions surged. Legal advocacy groups that had once remained silent now openly endorsed the bill, sensing the momentum was too strong to ignore. Leavitt delivered the closing argument for the bill in a speech that struck a balance between calm, conviction, and moral force. I was insulted in a courtroom not because I was wrong, she said, voice clear and unwavering, but because I stood up to power. I didn't respond with anger or revenge. I responded with faith in the law, in the truth, and in this country's ability to correct its own course. We now have the opportunity to make sure no American ever questions whether the courtroom is a place of justice or manipulation. That starts here. That starts now. The chamber was silent when she finished. Moments later, the vote was called. The bill passed the House with a surprising majority, including dozens of cross-party votes. A few days later, after a tense and closely watched Senate debate, it passed there as well. The president signed it into law in a quiet but symbolic ceremony, with Leavitt standing behind him, not as a political firebrand, but as the architect of one of the most sweeping judicial reform packages in modern American history. What had begun as a public insult transformed into legislation that would affect every courtroom in the nation. Yet, Leavitt didn't stop there. Her next initiative focused on expanding access to legal aid and judicial ethics training nationwide. She believed reform was not just about punishing corruption, but about preventing it through education, transparency, and vigilance. Meanwhile, the legacy of Judge Chambers faded into a cautionary tale, a symbol of unchecked power brought down not by scandal alone, but by the silent strength of someone he tried to humiliate. Karoline Leavitt never raised her voice in that courtroom. She didn't need to. The system spoke loud enough when the truth caught up to the bench, and in the years that followed, her story served as a reminder to every judge, politician, and public servant. Power is not a shield, truth is. With the Judicial Accountability and Transparency Act now law, a new era began across the American legal landscape. For the first time in decades, judges at every level, from local courts to federal benches, were subject to rigorous, independent audits. Financial disclosures were not only mandatory but publicly accessible, and perhaps most crucially, whistleblower protections empowered court staff to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. Karoline Leavitt, once a lightning rod for political controversy, had evolved into a symbol of principled reform. Her approval ratings surged. Even some of her fiercest critics in media circles were forced to reckon with what she had accomplished. Not just a political victory, but a systemic transformation. She didn't gloat. She didn't grandstand. She remained focused. But as the reforms began to take root, a deeper shift occurred, this time within the judiciary itself. Judges who had long operated behind veils of tradition and untouchability were now subject to new standards. Some retired quietly, unwilling to face scrutiny. Others adapted, embracing the transparency as a long overdue corrective. Law schools began integrating judicial ethics into their curricula with renewed seriousness, and legal aid clinics reported a surge in public trust. For Karoline, these victories weren't just abstract metrics, they were personal. She often thought back to that courtroom, the tension, the insult, the glare of a man used to power, and the weight of knowing she had to hold her ground. It would have been easy to react emotionally, to fire back, to make it a spectacle. But something deeper had guided her restraint that day, a belief that justice wasn't loud. It didn't shout or threaten. It simply endured. Now, that belief was policy. It was precedent. It was law. Still, with her rising influence came a new challenge, remaining grounded. Invitations poured in, TV appearances, speaking tours, book deals. Offers to run for higher office intensified. Some urged her to leverage her momentum and make a national run, even suggesting a bid for the vice presidency or higher. The temptation was real, but she moved carefully. In a closed meeting with her senior aides, she made her intentions clear. If I chase a title before finishing the work I've started, then I'm no better than the people I'm fighting against. This isn't about climbing, it's about cleaning, and there's still more to clean. She doubled down on local judicial oversight programs. She helped launch a bipartisan coalition focused on ethical governance in public institutions, and she pushed for the digital modernization of court records to make them more accessible and transparent for everyday citizens. Her enemies tried to find the crack in her armor. They dug into her past, her associations, her campaign donors, but they found little to weaponize. Her rise had not been built on scandal or spectacle. It had been built on resolve, on the strength to remain still when provoked, and the wisdom to act when the system called for courage. Years later, when asked about the moment that changed everything, she would always return to the same scene. The judge's glare, the insult, the pause, and then the sound of approaching footsteps, the marshals entering with the warrant. That wasn't justice arriving, she'd say quietly. That was justice catching up. And in the end, that moment didn't just define a courtroom. It defined a career, a movement, and a quiet revolution led by someone who proved that true strength isn't measured in volume or vengeance, but in the power to let the truth speak for itself. Karoline Leavitt had walked into a courtroom to be silenced. She left as the voice of a generation demanding justice that doesn't flinch. As Karoline Leavitt's reforms took root, she became more than a political figure. She became a quiet force of accountability across American institutions. Her focus sharpened not only on the courts, but on the culture that allowed corruption to fester behind polished wood panels and ceremonial robes. She believed the people deserved more than laws, they deserved integrity. Her next initiative was ambitious, the Public Integrity Project, a sweeping platform designed to extend oversight mechanisms across government agencies, law enforcement, and regulatory bodies. It called for independent ethics commissions at the state level, expanded protections for investigative journalists, and a national database tracking public officials disciplined for abuse of power. Critics said it was too broad, too idealistic, too much too fast. She didn't blink. At a national forum on institutional trust, she addressed the critics directly. "We keep asking why the public doesn't trust its institutions," she said. "The answer is simple. Trust isn't earned through press releases. It's earned through accountability, and that accountability has to be visible, enforceable, and constant." Her words hit a national nerve. As the Public Integrity Project gained traction, states across the country began adopting its pillars, voluntarily. Civic groups launched their own watchdog platforms. Universities developed research centers around government ethics and transparency. What had started as a single courtroom confrontation was now a movement of reform, reshaping how Americans interacted with their institutions. But with every step forward came friction. Powerful figures, some in politics, others in the judiciary, sought to slow her down. Investigations were opened into her campaign finances. Old acquaintances were paraded in the press in efforts to fabricate scandals. Anonymous leaks tried to paint her as overly ambitious, controlling, even ruthless behind the scenes. None of it stuck, because behind every accusation was a record of results. Behind every attack was a legacy of restraint. She didn't shout over, opposition. She let her work speak louder. As one journalist wrote in a profile piece, Karoline Leavitt doesn't rise by stepping on people. She rises by refusing to move when they try to push her down. Eventually, a documentary chronicling her story aired nationwide. Titled The Gavel and the Silence, it traced the arc from that courtroom insult to the day the Judicial Accountability Act was signed into law. Footage of Judge Chambers being led away in cuffs played against quiet shots of Leavitt walking down Capitol Hill, folder in hand, face calm. Viewers watched, mesmerized, as a single moment of humiliation turned into a national reckoning. Public reaction was overwhelming. Young women in law schools wrote letters thanking her for modeling strength without arrogance. Judges across the country began holding internal workshops on bias and ethics, inspired not by mandates, but by moral reflection. Leavitt never lost her center. She knew that real change didn't come in flashes. It came in steady, unrelenting pressure, like water against stone. Years later, standing at the opening of a new National Ethics Center bearing her name, Karoline took the podium and looked out at the crowd. She didn't speak of legacy or of politics or of victory. She spoke of discipline. Anyone can raise their voice, she said. But it takes discipline to hold your ground when you're being torn down. It takes discipline to stay quiet when you're being baited. And it takes discipline to trust the truth because the truth doesn't need help. It only needs time. And in that moment, the applause that followed wasn't just for what she had done. It was for what she had proven. That justice, when challenged, does not falter. It waits. And when the time is right, it walks in quiet and unstoppable, just like her. As Karoline Leavitt stood beneath the banner of the newly inaugurated Leavitt Center for Public Integrity, her message rippled far beyond the audience in attendance. The moment was more than ceremonial. It was a full-circle reckoning. What began with one judge's fall had become a blueprint for ethical governance across America. But even as the public celebrated her achievements, Karoline remained fixed on the work still unfinished. In private, she often reflected on the burden that came with being a symbol. She hadn't sought it, she hadn't staged that courtroom moment, and yet it had defined her. At night, she still remembered the tension in that room, the judge's sneer, the instinct to respond, the decision to remain still. That silence had echoed through the country, and now it echoed in her legacy. But Karoline wasn't content with legacy. She returned to the Hill with renewed purpose. Her next legislative target, campaign finance reform. She understood better than most how power could be bought and how influence quietly warped the scales of justice and legislation alike. Her bill, the Fair Influence Act, would require real-time reporting of political donations over $5,000 and eliminate the loopholes that allowed dark money to flow through shell nonprofits. Opposition was instant and fierce. Special interests mobilized. Lobbying firms funneled millions into attack ads. Her polling dipped. But Karoline didn't flinch. She didn't retreat into talking points or partisanship. Instead, she went to the very towns affected by corruption, the rural communities where public contracts went to cronies, the cities where building permits could be bought, the states where voters had lost all faith in their institutions. She listened. She spoke simply. Not like a politician, but like a citizen who knew what it felt like to be dismissed by someone in power. You don't lose a democracy all at once, she told a crowd in Ohio. You lose it in pieces, in the silence after an insult, in the corners where no one's looking, in the deals no one questions, and I'm here to say not anymore. Slowly, the momentum returned. Editorial boards endorsed her legislation. Former opponents crossed the aisle. Protesters turned to supporters. The same discipline that had steadied her in that courtroom began to steady a fractured Congress. The Fair Influence Act passed, narrowly, but it passed. And when it did, Karoline didn't claim credit. She credited the voters who refused to stay silent, the whistleblowers who risked everything, and the belief that even in a cynical system, truth still had power. That year, as her name appeared on the short list for a national ticket, she didn't announce a campaign. Not yet. Instead, she returned to the Leavitt Center and gave a lecture to a group of high school students visiting from across the country. One student raised their hand and asked, "How did you stay calm when that judge insulted you?" Karoline paused, then answered slowly, "Because I wasn't standing there for myself. I was standing there for everyone who's ever been talked down to by someone who thought they couldn't be touched. And I knew, if I cracked, if I lashed out, he'd win. But if I stood still, the truth would carry me." The room went quiet. Then she smiled, just slightly, and added, "And it did." The students applauded, not out of duty, but because they saw what she had proven again and again. That dignity is power, that truth is patient, and that sometimes the strongest voice in the room is the one that doesn't need to shout. In the years that followed, Karoline Leavitt's work continued, not in flashes of viral drama, but in steady, unshakable progress. She became known not just for what she accomplished, but for how she did it. With composure under pressure, discipline, in the face of chaos, and a relentless refusal to compromise on core principles. Though urged to run for higher office, Karoline held off, always asking herself the same question. Am I needed more on the campaign trail, or in the fight to finish? What I started? The answer, more often than not, was the latter. By her mid-30s, the landscape of American governance looked different. Judicial transparency was the norm. Ethics commissions had become standard practice. Dark money in politics had been curbed significantly, and new generations of public servants, judges, attorneys, lawmakers, entered their roles with a clear understanding that accountability was no longer optional. She remained in public service but avoided the cult of personality. No book deals, no vanity memoir, no self-congratulatory tours. Her interviews were rare, and when she did speak, it was only to move the needle on policy, not popularity. Eventually, she passed the torch, training and mentoring a new wave of reformers who had grown up watching her example. When asked what she hoped they'd take from her legacy, she simply said, "That silence isn't weakness, it's a choice. And if you use it well, it can speak louder than any headline ever will." Karoline Leavitt never sought fame, but history remembered her, not as the young woman insulted in court, but as the woman who refused to strike back and instead stood still. Until justice came walking in. That moment changed everything, not because of what was said, but because of what she refused to say, and what she chose to do instead. The gavel fell, the system trembled, and Karoline Leavitt stood firm, so the truth could rise, and it did.